Morning, everyone, including you, freedom lover, who was quick to the switch this morning, an angry dog. Welcome back to Law and Legitimacy. It's a somber Tuesday. I'm watching developments in Israel and the Gaza Strip with an increase, and New York City and the campus of Harvard University, feeling very much a stranger in a strange world, and increasingly angry about what I'm seeing. As you all know, this weekend, Hamas, a group that organizes and is responsible for what goes on in the Gaza Strip, acts as a quasi-government, although it's not been recognized as such in the world, and is regarded by many as a terrorist organization, staged a surprise attack on Israel, launching across borders, separating the Gaza Strip from Israel, and killing hundreds, as many as 1,000 Israelis, including several hundred people at an all-night rave concert, and kidnapping more than 100 civilians, taking them back into the Gaza Strip. Israel responded and is responding with fury. But what makes this conflict so much more difficult than every conflict that we've seen, at least in my lifetime, in the Middle East, and perhaps even in the conflicts that we have seen historically in the 20th century, involving the creation of the state of Israel, is that Hamas is up the ante in this case. Hamas is an area about half the size of greater New York, or I think of New York City, metropolitan New York City. The Gaza Strip is an area about that size. It contains about 2.3 million people, and it is heavily dependent on Israel for electricity, food supplies, and whatnot. In this assault this weekend, Hamas took Israeli citizens, some of them infants, some of them old women, some of them women, some of them soldiers, and has declared to Israel, we know you're going to react, but for every house that you blow up, we're going to execute one of the hostages, and you're going to be forcing our hands to do so, and we're going to do so publicly. And so they're going to make a public display of savagery, and they're going to blame Israel for it. And this places, in my view, Israel in a very difficult position. As far its military and its intelligence community was caught unawares by this attack, and when things calm down, they're going to have to determine what happened, when, and why. And I suspect it has to do with internal politics in Israel that mirror what's going on in the United States, a broader crisis of legitimacy as populists seek to regain control of their own lives and country in the face of increasing global pressures. Netanyahu is a populist candidate. He was seeking to restrike the balance between Israel's judiciary and other institutions in ways that responded to the populist impulse, but that alienated neoliberals. And the result was broad scale prediction, I don't know if that's the right word, suspicion that Israeli society was a failed bargain. It was a bargain that was failing, and there were reports that thousands, if not tens of thousands, of Israelis were not going to respond to voluntary calls for military service. And you can't help but wonder whether all of this preoccupation with the lack of a common vision of the good led them to take the eyes off their borders, their eyes off the ball, as it were, their eyes off the ever-present threat of violence at the perimeter of their lives. And Hamas took advantage of it. But now this seizure of hostages, this threat to execute children and women, and to broadcast the images on public television or on the internet, and to say that somehow this is Israel's fault for responding to an incursion on its borders, slaughter of its people. This should be provoking outrage in the world. But instead, what we're getting, at least in certain parts of the United States and other parts of the world, I'm sure, is marches in support of Hamas and condemning Israel. There was a march at Times Square yesterday, people supporting Hamas and blaming Israel for the atrocities to come. At Harvard, 31 student groups have gathered together to show their support for the Palestinians, and implicit in these marches is an endorsement of the means used to oppose apartheid in Israel. And those means include violence. Those means include the abduction of innocent women and children. Those means include the slaughter of those people and their publication of the images on social media. And all of this, the protesters will argue, is justified because Israel continues to occupy territory that historically belonged to the Palestinians. I don't doubt for a moment that there are serious, perhaps permanent, perhaps insoluble regional tensions in the Middle East. I don't doubt that for a moment. And I don't doubt that the search for a diplomatic solution to these tensions is difficult and perhaps itself insoluble. But the turn to savagery, the glorification of violence, the justification of the killing of innocent people on both sides can't help but make me terrified about our prospects in the United States, because I'll make a prediction here that this is a sort of bellwether event in the global community. If the dispossessed in the Middle East have a right to resort to savagery to justify their claims, and the left is prepared to endorse that savagery as a justifiable tactic, why isn't that same tactic applicable in the United States? If we have historically oppressed minorities in the United States, aren't those minorities justified in using whatever they can to seek quote unquote justice, whether that be in the form of territory, reparations, or whatever it is that they seek? And how are campus activists and protesters on Times Square going to draw a line that distinguishes killing civilians gratuitously in the Middle East from doing likewise here in the United States? You know, folks who worry about civil war, and I got to plug the light in here. Folks who worry about civil war and violence in the United States, incident to our growing disaffection with one another, I think have good reason to pay extremely close attention to what's going on in the Middle East and to take names, because there will be an uptick in violence in the United States, in my view, as a result of not just Hamas's reaction to Israel, but also of Israel's reaction to Hamas and observers' reactions to both. You know, I tossed and turned last night. It's interesting in evaluating international affairs to, and perhaps unavoidable to ask, what's the right solution? What's the right reaction? What would I do if I were a commander, let's say in Israel, of the defense force, or a politician asked for a policy recommendation? Hamas has upped the ante in terror. It's gambled that the abduction of civilians and the threat to execute them will be a gambit that gets them the concessions they want. And Israel has to decide whether it will yield to that sort of pressure, or whether it will decide to press on and destroy its adversary, even at the cost of damaging itself, even at the cost of losing its hostages. And, I'm hard pressed to know what I would do. I think that in terms of the microscopic or microeconomic analysis, the loss of any individual life is a tragedy. But knuckling under to the abduction of your population and the threat to execute them in response to the demands of a terrorist group, no matter how abused or maligned they have been by the forces of history, strikes me as a far more dangerous precedent to be set. Do we really want to conduct international affairs by knuckling under to the person who's got balls big enough to kidnap the most civilians and threaten to kill them unless we give them what we want? So I think in terms of Israel's response to this, candidly, were I an Israeli general right now, I'd be looking to make the Gaza Strip into a parking lot. And I would root out every single person that could be identified as responsible for this attack and seek their death. This is an act of war. And I think Israel has a right to respond with violence. There is a theory of just war. Reaches back to Augustine. Michael Walzer at Princeton wrote a really good book in the 70s, I think, called Just and Unjust Wars. And a just war can be a war of defense, a war where, upon being attacked, you engage in proportionate response, or a proportionate reprisal. And the difficulty for military policymakers and policymakers is determining what a proportionate response is. Israel has to somehow choke back its rage and has to decide whether the likely death of the hostages taken is worth the cost of the response. I don't know what you all think, but I think with a heavy heart, I would say press on and seek to immobilize Hamas and seek to cripple its infrastructure, seek to kill and or prosecute its leaders as war criminals, and do so without second thoughts, but with a heavy, heavy heart. And I say that because the message that's being sent to the international community right now is how tolerant are we going to be of what I will now call, and I've never used this expression before, something new, justifiable savagery. It's okay to kidnap a grandmother. It's okay to kidnap a child. It's okay to threaten to kill them to get what you want, so long as what you want is justifiable. That kind of conduct has always been regarded as barbaric. And to give it any quarter in the international community, at Harvard, on Times Square, in your community, at your coffee shop, I think is to turn a dark corner and to encourage others to conclude that violence is the way for them to get what they want. And so, today I stand wholeheartedly, I'm not sure where you are, Mike, with Israel in the midst of making these heartbreaking and consequential decisions. But I'm urging Israel to make a strong, furious, and resolute response to this attack, because I think the message it sends will reverberate throughout the world. And the message is Israel's not responsible for Hamas's execution of its civilians. That falls on Hamas, and it falls on each and every hypocrite who appeared in a public forum in the United States yesterday to say that the killing of innocents is justified by the ends. That sort of reasoning has never been a route to the moral high ground. It is a road to disaster. And if we embrace it in Israel, we'll be looking at it soon enough. And I would predict this winter in the United States, because what are you going to say, as we talked yesterday, to the freezing homeless person on the streets of Chicago? Go home, or, okay, you can have my spare room. Now give me my daughter back. Right. These are mistakes we're playing right now. And I think people who are not seeing it in these terms are kidding themselves.
I want to read this joint statement by the Harvard Palestine Solidarity Groups on the situation in Palestine.
Have you wound up enough today?
So I think I sent an article to you that appeared first in the New York Sun that was quoting the former president of Harvard University, Larry Summers, about his disillusionment and complete feeling of alienation from the institution that he used to preside over, in response to this statement and the recognition that there were or are 31 student groups within the Harvard University system that joined this letter. And so I'll read the letter first. We, the undersigned student organizations, hold the Israeli regime entirely responsible for all unfolding violence. Today's events did not occur in a vacuum. For the last 2 decades, millions of Palestinians in Gaza have been forced to live in an open-air prison. Israeli officials promised to, quote, open the gates of hell, end quote, and the massacre in Gaza have already commenced. Palestinians in Gaza have no shelter for refuge and nowhere to escape. In the coming days, Palestinians will be forced to bear the full brunt of Israel's violence. The apartheid regime is the only one to blame. Israeli violence has structured every aspect of Palestinian existence for 75 years. From systematized land seizures to routine airstrikes, arbitrary detentions to military checkpoints, and enforced family separations to targeted killings, Palestinians have been forced to live in a state of death, both slow and sudden. Today, the Palestinian ordeal enters into uncharted territory. The coming days will require a firm stand against colonial retaliation. We call on the Harvard community to take action to stop the ongoing annihilation of Palestinians.
Here's my response if I were Harvard student, which I never was, and never would be, and probably couldn't be. Yes, history is tragic. Yes, the world is filled with violence. But yet, while the United States struggles with its open borders to find a place for every person who seeks to migrate here, because they find their conditions of existence intolerable for one reason or another in their home, where has the Arab world been with respect to the Palestinians? They have used the Palestinians as a prop. No one has welcomed their brother, their fellow Arabs or fellow Muslims into their home country and said, what's happened to you is wrong and it's difficult, but we have abundance, we have wealth, we have room. Come, our borders are open to you. I'm hard pressed to think of a single Islamic country in the world that is a destination for immigrants, including fellow Muslims. This business about these Harvard students and their desire to hold Israel accountable for the apartheid in Palestine and in Israel falls on deaf ears here. When Israel was declared a independent nation in 1948, the Arab world resolved to, quote unquote, push them into the sea. It resolved to annihilate the state of Israel. In a series of wars of aggression since Israel's formation, the aggressors have continually lost territory. And I suspect the result will be the same here. This has done nothing to foster a sense of cooperative willingness to live together. I'm aware of Arab Israelis who are shocked and appalled by Hamas's activities. The challenge of people living together with different worldviews, the challenge of coming together in peace amid a territorial expansion and amid the loss of territory, which many Palestinians did lose in the 20th century, is an example of tragic history. Augustine, I always return to Augustine in times of crisis. Augustine wrote The City of God to warn against the city of God versus the city of man. If you pin all of your hopes on your prospects in this world, that's love of the wrong thing. And it's going to result in death. It's going to result in destruction because, as the good book says, the wages of sin are death. I'm not claiming that Israel has the moral high ground here. I do know that the creation of a Jewish state required the cooperation of the international community, and the international community acted to create Israel and to support it since 1948. Israel has made efforts to accommodate and to incorporate members of other people into the state. There is a thriving Arab community in Israel, but the notion that there are rejectionists who are going to conclude that until the tragedy, in their view, of the creation of the state of Israel is addressed and resolved, and property is returned to its rightful owners, people who owned it more than a century ago, there can be nothing but tension and bloodshed, is an invitation to more tension and bloodshed. And it's the sort of identity politicking that's ripping the United States apart. And I say, look at Palestine, look at Israel, look at the tensions, look at the violence there. And that's a fast forward version of the seeds we're sowing in the United States.
That's where I was hoping we would get to, Norm.
Moral imbecile who stands on Harvard's campus and holds Israel accountable for Hamas's terrorism is a traitor to common sense, is a traitor to decency, and is themselves an incipient terrorist who, in the back of their heart, in the recesses of their soul, conclude that those who disagree with them perhaps have sacrificed the right to live, the right to exist. Because if you start to endorse the means that Hamas has used here, all hope is lost. And to blame Israel for responding in self-defense, it simply falls on deaf ears.
Yeah, the old adage, "Don't throw a stone and hide your hand," strikes me as apt here. But one thing I wanted to follow up with here, professor of law, emeritus professor of law at Harvard, Alan Dershowitz. You may have heard of him before. He was quoted as saying that the student group's statement, quote, that represents a push, quote, by every major university towards professors and administrators propagandizing students toward woke bigotry. He went on to say, the answer to such lies is truth. The real tragedy is that some of these students will be the leaders of America and the world tomorrow. And I say that because I want to bring this back to the theme of our stream, Norm. My concern, my personal concern with this, I think, again, just to reiterate what I told you yesterday, and I think I also said on the stream, is that it's quite difficult for me to feel confident talking about the tactical points of what's going on in the Middle East between Israel and Palestine. I think each of us watching this stream in some way, shape, or form know and care about people of Palestinian heritage and of Israeli and or Jewish heritage, right? And this makes for a very complicated personal endeavor trying to find where one's loyalties, quote unquote, lie. And I personally feel like that's a fool's errand. I think the issue that we are confronted as a country and as a community is understanding and observing that the woke orthodoxy is contained within our most reputable historically of institutions, namely something like Harvard, which has been for the last several years under tremendous scrutiny, right? And as pointed out in the Sun article, was very quick to throw its institutional support behind the cause of Ukraine, right? And wields enormous cultural capital. And I also call back to what I said yesterday. This is my personal problem, the hypocrisy embedded in the way that the ADL throws its weight around and bullies the hell out of individuals in the United States for their, in conjunction with their First Amendment rights, and then has no concept, very similar to the way we are criticizing these student groups and anybody who's saying that all of this lies at the feet of a colonial response, that would be Israel's response to the attack that was lobbed on them. It's very similar that we would have as a country allowed the media sphere, that media class, to bully the hell out of every individual that seems to step out of line with the established orthodoxy, and then not see something like this building as an undercurrent in American culture. This is a reflection of what happens when you are not honest with the way that you perpetuate these issues and sensibilities around what might happen again in 1939 Weimar Germany, right? When you use this as, and I'm not trying to lay blame at any particular people, nor I'm pointing out the hypocrisy of the moment that you and I find overlap and common ground on being able to attribute absolute one-sided blame to Hamas in doing this, and they have earned every bit of what comes.
No, they have.
But our issue here is the legitimacy of our governing institutions and the institutions of higher learning that are, I guess, embodied by the likes of Harvard, our Ivy Leagues, right? How many presidents have we had that have been either an undergraduate or a law graduate from Harvard, right? Yale. The irony of this is that we now have an entire generation of people that are hostile, absolutely hostile to the Western ideal. And we haven't, for some reason, we're unable to parse these two things, to hold two things in our mind as an honest society that, hey, yeah, perhaps crying wolf and then banning the likes of Alex Jones, treating Ye like a complete psychopath, racist idiot, right? Doing these things that matter to young people in public, telling people that they're stupid and that they're ignorant, that they're deplorable for seeing things and saying things, and wielding that cudgel against them wouldn't have some obvious consequence. Well, here we are, America. We are unified in this problem of the fractal nature of warfare in 2023. Riots can be catalyzed like that. We've seen it in New York. We've seen it in Philadelphia. And now we're watching issues abroad. We've never confronted this kind of issue, Norm, as a modern society. We've never been so vulnerable as a civilized society where issues that occur abroad can be catalyzed and can metastasize stateside in an instant. And we have an immigration crisis that's going on right now that has gone unfettered, that is going to fuel that. And that's what I'm concerned about.
Well, I think that's true. It's going to be it's going to be an interesting couple of months and an interesting winter. Let's pivot real quick because I got a hard stop today. I got
You do.
5 court appearances.
Where we going?
Let's talk a little bit about the Donald Trump's motion to dismiss. Yesterday there were reports about the motion to dismiss in the press, and people were claiming double jeopardy and whatnot. And it's not a double jeopardy issue, but it is a significant presidential powers issue. And so the president, has taken an oath upon his being sworn to office that he will faithfully execute the laws of the United States. And that doesn't mean he'll kill them. It means that he'll bring them into effect. It means that he gets the right to use his judgment to set priorities and to engage in such enforcement actions of the law as he and his team see fit. We have a separation of powers doctrine that permits those aggrieved by those decisions or those who think that the president has overstepped his boundaries to bring actions in court to impose constitutional limits on the president. We have an impeachment process wherein Congress can seek to impeach a president or remove him from office if they think he's not doing a good job. But what we've never had in the United States I'm unaware of this. Is a policy of prosecuting a president for the judgment calls he makes in office. And I think that the motion filed by his team in the J6, the January 6th case, claiming that the action should be dismissed on grounds of presidential immunity is far from frivolous. It's far from frivolous because when you look at the events from November 20th, the early November of 2020 to January 6, 2021, what you see is an unbroken effort on Donald Trump's behalf to take back an election that he claims to have think was stolen. He persuaded many others that it was. There were certainly irregularities in it. I think the real issues in the electoral cycle that year were in part changing demographics, in part the effect of the pandemic and the widespread use of absentee ballots in a way that was unprecedented in American presidential politics. But within the White House itself and within Donald Trump, there were political maneuvers meant and intended to, quote unquote, stop the steal. Alternative electors, getting Mike Pence not to certify the election, calls to other electoral officials. And these were calls that were undertaken by a president and his administration while they were the duly sworn president, while they represented the executive branch. And suddenly we now have members of the executive branch prosecuted criminally for the actions they undertook under cloak of presidential authority. If you think about that, that's just amazing. Because we don't want to grant absolute immunity to anybody in this country, obviously. No one is above the law. I get the mantra and I respect the mantra. But in terms of the operation of government, you can't sue a political official because you disagree with their views. There's something called the political question doctrine that makes that a non-justiciable claim in court. Donald Trump has brought it right to the heart of the constitutional issues at stake here, claiming that while he was the duly elected president of the United States, you may have disagreed with his judgments, but he had the right to use the political system to execute the laws. There's no proof that he organized violence on January 6th. There was a riot. People were emotional, but our institutions held. Donald Trump never called out the military. He never cut off He never cut off power to Congress, electrical power. He never sought to use violence against an individual to prevent them from doing his duties. He used his bully pulpit. He used his political pull. He urged his supporters to act, and some of them did, in fact, overreact. But the notion that he can now be charged criminally for his acts as president while running for president again is a terrifying precedent in American law. Expect Judge Chutman to deny the motion, expect it to go up immediately on appeal, and expect it to be skyrocketed to the Supreme Court. This is a case that has never occurred in the United States before. The Justice Department has informally recognized the doctrine of presidential immunity. Now it's being put to the test. Let's see what the courts do.
Agreed. And I highlighted just a couple sentences there from the introduction of his motion that I think are particularly powerful. They get at what you were analyzing there under the Presidential Powers Act norm, in particular, the outer perimeter of his official responsibilities. And then the clear break in what they would consider 234 years of precedent, and ascribing to Trump of knowledge that he knew things, purportedly knew things, and that is what distinguishes this from any other investigation or any other, I guess, backward-facing analysis of presidential actions.
It's from a frivolous issue. I'm intrigued by this. This is the constitutional issue of the next decade. Let's see what happens in this case.
Agreed. I know we're over time here, so we'll have to get back to our boy Elon some other time.
Yeah, Elon. Yeah, we will. I got to run. I've got court appearances.
I know you do. Yeah, you've got what, 5 states to be in today? 3 states, 5 states? What do you got?
3 cities, 5 cases, a little bit of murder and mayhem.
Just a little bit. All right, Norm. I'll get you out of here and I'll close up. I'll see you later. I'm going to remove you from the stream. No hard feelings. But everybody, thank you for being here. We will be here tomorrow, Wednesday, Thursday, and Friday. But we've got a couple of surprises for you. I'll be co-hosting with several other people for the balance of the week as Norm completes his travel. So please be sure to tune in as much as I can. I'll give some advance notice as to who may be joining us and what we'll be talking about, but we will not break rank. We will be here 8 a.m. for the balance of the week, just to make sure that you guys trust that we're not falling off our game. Anyway, thank you for being here. You can find us on X at LawPod Daily, YouTube. We're live every morning there at LawPod Daily, as well as on Rumble. You can also find us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Play, Overcast, wherever you find podcasts. Please consider leaving us 5 stars and a generous review. As I always say, leave us 5 stars or leave us alone. And if you're also feeling like you want to be closer to the community as we head into the fall and winter, Norm and I both will be sort of circling the wagons around stabilizing the content for the platform and on a website and through what we're doing already on locals. We want that to be more of a consistent archive for those of you who like to come back to things. Right now, things are just sort of exist in an unorganized library on these various platforms. And while we have all that information, curating that and organizing it is a difficult task. But we've got several things that we're working on here, so we appreciate you staying around with us. I will be back tomorrow morning at 8 a.m. See you later.